Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. Welcome to Scary October. It's no coincidence that this is the month for campfire stories and cybersecurity awareness training. Both create fear from familiar things. Both can teach lessons about trust, but only one involves PowerPoint slides. Which means this week we have a sponsored interview with Rob Allen about ransomware, how it targets orgs, and what orgs can do to ideally not have ransomware anywhere around them. Grab a flashlight and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. Ransomware, supply chain attacks, 0 days. Cyber threats don't wait, and neither should your defenses. With ThreatLocker, you're not just reacting to threats, you're stopping them before they start. Our Zero Trust endpoint protection locks down your environment with pinpoint control over what's allowed to run and what's not. No guesswork, no blind spots. Just proactive, built-for-now security that keeps your business moving. Want to see how a true default deny strategy works? Head over to securityweekly.com/threatlocker and take the first step towards shutting the door on threats before they even knock. This is episode 353, recorded October 17th, 2025, a little bit early from our usual Monday. I'm your host, Mike Shima, your usual host, and we have an unusual announcement for you. Don't miss InfoSec World 2025 this October 27th to 29th at Disney's Coronado Springs Resort. There'll be cybersecurity pros, workshops before and after, making a nice long week, and endless networking, which sounds more fun than ominous. Save 25% with code ISW25-SW over at securityweekly.com/ISW2025. And with that, finally, I can introduce our guest. Rob is a Chief Product Officer at ThreatLocker. He has over 2 decades of experience helping businesses embrace technology while navigating its evolving challenges. And now he's helping orgs recover from attacks and implement proactive defenses, which I think we're going to come back to a couple times, to secure their futures. Hello, Rob. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. By the way, I'm going to be at InfoSec World. I believe
Wonderful.
I'm
there you
speaking
go.
at InfoSec World. Would you believe? So, yes.
Even better. So listen to this on the Monday and then go say hi to Rob in person and thank him for all of the wonderful wisdom he's about to impart for us. So I'm setting that up before, of course.
I don't want
hear
to set
from you.
unfair and unrealistic expectations for people, but
No, unfair and unrealistic expectations, if there are any out there, it comes from, I want to say, Appsec teams who just say, go do this, write secure software, patch all your things, don't get hacked. It's easy to go through a checklist. It's easy to have a top 10 list, but it's a lot harder to actually implement that. And I think especially from the ransomware perspective that you work on, you see how that fails. We actually honestly don't talk about ransomware too much on ASW, and I think everybody knows what it is, but maybe you could just give us a quick overview of the hows and whys of what ransomware looks like in 2025 right now.
well, funnily enough, ransomware itself is probably, although the overall market for cyber attacks is growing, ransomware itself, as in the encryption of data, is probably not as prevalent as it once was, or it's only really happening. I don't want to say it's only happening in a limited number of cases, but a lot of the ransomware gangs now, what people have in their head with ransomware is something runs on my machine and encrypts all my files.
Yes, that's what I'm thinking.
That's not necessarily what it is in 2025. I saw a statistic yesterday, 96% of ransomware attacks involve data exfiltration. And some of the ransomware gangs now actually tell their affiliates, you don't need to run ransomware. All you need to do is exfiltrate data, because very often that's what you're going to get paid on. Now, you do still obviously have what are called double extortion attacks. So double extortion being, I'm going to encrypt your stuff and I'm going to steal your stuff. And it gives you a better chance as an attacker of getting paid. So yeah, the idea of what people have in their head of ransomware, which is something runs on my computer and all my files get encrypted and, I recover from a backup and everything is fine. That's not necessarily the case, because as I said, in the vast majority of cases, what they're interested in is maximizing the possibility that they're going to get paid, which means stealing all your stuff and maybe encrypting your stuff as well.
Yeah, and so absolutely, there's still a focus on that data. And I do want to keep our audience in suspense, since it's October and Halloween theme, about getting to the proactive and defending side. But first, I do want to talk about some of the attacks, because they can be very much of like, wow, really, that's all it took? Or, from one particular, maybe unconstructive AppSec side, it's like, that was so simple. And here I'm thinking of, what was it, a year ago, 2 years ago, Fortinet, going to pick on one vendor, but like VPN devices, edge devices just seem to be the way in. Is that still the case in 2025? Or how are those ransomware actors getting that initial foothold?
That is probably the easiest way. If you can run a scan, if you can find devices that are vulnerable to particular CVE that hasn't been patched, then realistically as an attacker, it's the simplest thing to do. You don't need to target individual organizations. I mean, realistically, you'd be very unlucky to be specifically targeted by a ransomware gang. I mean, the chances of that happening to your average business are not quite zero, but approaching zero. Realistically, the only way that somebody's after you and you specifically is if it's either hacktivists or nation states. And the reality is that isn't happening to most organizations. So it is, in a lot of cases, just kind of spray and pray. But again, if you can just run a script against entire subnets or massive parts of the internet looking for specific devices with specific vulnerabilities, then it's trivial. And again, in a lot of cases, once you have that initial access, once you've got access to something like a firewall, whether it be, and look, in some cases, it's not even running scripts, it's just going onto the dark web and buying credentials. You know what I mean? So info stealers are picking up data left, right, and center. And who's to say whether your, SSL VPN connection details aren't in there? If you don't have MFA turned on that, then realistically, attackers don't even have to run scripts against the entire internet. All they do is go and buy some credentials or buy access to an environment. But it's probably the easiest way. Again, I'm not going to say that all organizations have really strong defenses internally either, because I think the evidence would suggest that some of them don't. But again, it's the low-hanging fruit that these guys are going for. I mean, why would you do something or attack somewhere that's going to be really, really hard work and it's going to take you months or years to do it? Or, I can hit 10 organizations that are just slightly less secure than they should be.
Yeah, I imagine there's still that consideration of what's our hourly rate. Do we want to spend a lot of time working on the 0 day, or do we want to go after this known vulnerability that a year later just actually happens to still exist?
That hasn't been patched, unfortunately. It is a sad fact of life. I mean, there's a couple of parts to patching these. Well, I mean, there's a couple of parts of vulnerabilities and patching. I mean, the first is, everything is vulnerable. It's just a question of, do we know about it being vulnerable? I mean, look at your average Patch Tuesday from Microsoft. How many serious vulnerabilities are addressed in each one? I think I saw this Patch Tuesday there was 8 criticals. Everything is full of holes. I'm talking to you on Chrome right now. I have no doubt that the Chrome that I'm using right now is also full of holes. But the same applies to firewalls. Same applies to switches. I mean, I saw an interesting thing yesterday about installing rootkits on switches. Because fundamentally they're just running Linux in a lot of cases. So just assume everything is vulnerable and act accordingly. But obviously you should patch your things. But again, the patch that you apply, how many vulnerabilities are in that patch as well?
Yeah, and I want to I love the act accordingly, because I think there's a lot of things that kind of hides, in the sense of, you were talking about patching, and I think rightfully so. But the act accordingly can also, I would hope, involve things like, do you have MFA deployed? Do you have strong MFA, like passkeys? That'll be one of my favorite things. Or even just network isolation, network segmentation. These feel like some things that can at least help reduce ransomware. Is that actually what you've seen in practice? Like, are these, whatever I've off, like MFA, network segmentation, are these just purely missing? Or do these actually still exist, but ransomware is still bypassing weaknesses in controls, or just areas people forget about?
The short answer is it depends. Very often, it's literally just not, if it's something like a VPN, for example, it's not MFA'd, or you've got 100 VPN accounts and 99 of them are MFA'd and you forgot one. I mean, I don't think that would be tremendously unusual. I mean, the other side to it is if you're talking about CVEs and so on with firewalls, then it doesn't matter if you got MFA on your anything, because fundamentally that's all going to be bypassed. So as I said, there's a couple of ways to it, but the fact of the matter is that fundamentally anything you expose to the internet is expanding your attack surface. So it doesn't matter if it's a management port on a firewall, it doesn't matter if it's a VPN. I mean, people have this kind of false sense of security around VPNs, and they think, oh, VPNs are secure, they're encrypted, they're going to keep me safe. But the fact is, it is another port exposed to the internet. It is increasing your attack surface. And if there is any sort of a vulnerability in that VPN hardware, or as I said, if you've forgotten to MFA one of your accounts, then it can literally just be game over.
And that makes me think too, I'm going to pick the easy parts because you're the guest. I'll send the harder questions over to you. But, one of the things that these orgs have in common are unpatched VPN devices, perhaps, or just an unpatched endpoint. That's kind of obvious. It's also kind of maybe easy to say what these orgs have in common that they're not doing, in the sense that probably there's a longer list of what they're not doing, what they are doing. But in that spirit of what these orgs could have been doing differently, or basically if we predicate this idea that maybe we do have an insecure or an unpatched VPN, what could have they been do differently? What could they be? What's their defensive depth is basically what I'm trying to ask here that they're missing.
Well, as you said, network segmentation is something that is very important. Flat networks are a huge problem. Problem in a lot of cases, though, and this is where it starts getting really fun, is that a lot of people will have their, for example, firewall device, their VPN, hooked up to their Active Directory. And the problem is, if I get in as Rob on the firewall, then effectively I'm authenticated in the Active Directory as well, and all of a sudden I can access files and file shares, which makes it really easy for me to start encrypting data on those file shares. And that's something that Microsoft actually mentioned. Microsoft do this digital defense report every year, and they have an entire section devoted to ransomware. And a couple of really interesting takeaways was they mentioned 92% of attacks involve unmanaged devices as part of, or 92% of successful attacks leverage unmanaged devices as part of the attack. But the other really interesting thing was 70% of attacks involve remote encryption. So remote encryption being something that is unprotected on the network, encrypting data on something that is protected on the network. There was a really interesting case it must have been a couple of months ago now, where an attacker had access to a server. So they basically got onto a server and they tried to run ransomware. The EDR that they were running picked it up, deleted it, did what it was supposed to do.
Sounds good.
What they then did, which was really clever, was they then pivoted to, believe it or not, a CCTV camera on the network. They ran a scan on the network. They said, oh, there's a CCTV camera over there with a vulnerability. They were able to exploit that vulnerability, get access to the CCTV camera and run the ransomware from it. So encrypt the data on the server from a CCTV camera. So again, it comes back to flat networks being a huge problem. Even aside from the whole, LinkedIn to Active Directory, and I've got access as soon as I've got access to your VPN, you also have to consider all of those other things that are on your network right now. And in a lot of cases, there is a lot of stuff. Whether it be CCTV cameras, I had the privilege, we have an event here in Orlando every February, March, Zero Trust World. And I had the privilege last year of speaking to quite a number of penetration testers. And they said to me that their favorite thing to see on a network is a printer. Because printers are sitting on networks very often for, 5, 6, 7, sometimes 10 years, never patched, never updated, never even thought about, always on parts of the network where people need to access them, so always where they want to attack. So, I can pretty much guarantee if a penetration tester loves to see something like a printer in a network, you'd be guaranteed that a bad guy does too. But yeah, the remote encryption thing is huge. So as I said, those unmanaged devices could be something like that CCTV camera, but it also could be just a VM that an attacker spins up on your network. It could be a VM that an attacker has outside of your network, but is connected to your network through, as we said, a VPN.
I love the CCTV example because I'm thinking of the classic Blade Runner enhance, and now we're just shifting it to Blade Runner like encrypt as you're just looking at the data, and there it goes.
Funnily enough, my favorite is a terrible word to use in the context of cyber attacks, but one of my favorite cyber attacks of the last number of years wasn't a big attack on the cinema and on the casino in Vegas recently. It was another one prior to that, and it was perpetrated via a smart heater in a fish tank. A smart heater in a fish tank was basically used as a jump-off point in the network to attack a server. So yeah, as I said, it's favorite is a terrible word to use in this context, but I'm going to stick with it. But yeah, smart heater in a fish tank. Like, why does a smart heater in a fish tank need to talk to your server? It just doesn't under any circumstances. So why would you let a smart heater in a fish tank talk to your server? And as you said, look, you can do that via network segmentation. You can do it via hardware. Problem with that is it's not always practical because it is, generally speaking, it's quite expensive and quite complicated to implement. So you need a fairly hefty budget and somebody who really knows what they're doing in certain terms of setting these things up. One of the things that we do is we can do it effectively from the endpoint. So we can say, look, I only want to allow trusted devices connect to my server. So if you're a trusted device, you can connect on this port. If you're not, you can't. So it solves that problem of unmanaged devices encrypting data on managed devices.
Yeah, and I think I do want to bring in that budget aspect, not on specific numbers, but in the spirit of we live in the world of bug bounties, which are very collaborative ways of external people identifying a flaw and actually quantifying it. So the one thing I like about bug bounties is you can say this was a bug that cost us $100, $10,000, etc. Very rarely do we have good quantifiable things like that within security. Ransomware is similar to bug bounty, less collaborative, but also I think that the pay sounds like it's a lot better. Mm. And where I was going with that is maybe actually you could probably tell us about a couple examples of what that pay looks like. But part of it is how do you turn that incentive from, well, here's the ransom that costs you X, but you could have spent half that, a tenth of that, some smaller amount on being proactive. And it's sort of that, it is setting up that rhetorical question of what's preventing companies from being more proactive. Is it just budget or is it something else?
It's really difficult to say. I mean, it's a sad fact of life that it often takes something happening for organizations to take these things seriously, to realize that it could be them. And unfortunately, by the time you realize it could be you, it's probably too late. It is you. So that is an unfortunate fact of life in terms of, what it might cost you to protect yourself versus what it might cost you if you get hit. I mean, you pick a number, X basically is what it costs you if you get hit. I mean, I think I saw there was an organization recently who the ransom that was demanded of them was $94 million. Now, the ransomware gangs tend to be somewhat scientific in what they demand. So obviously, if they steal all your data, there's a fairly good chance that they might have some bank records and bank statements there. So they know how much money you have. They'll also, very often, one of the first things they'll look for is cyber insurance. So they'll try and see, are you cyber insurance covered? So how much will your cyber insurance pay out in the event of an attack? So generally speaking, in terms of what you have in the bank, the sweet spot seems to be somewhere around 30%. So if they ask for everything you have in the bank, the fact is you're probably not going to pay it. But why would they ask you for 5% of what you have in your bank? It's pretty much a case of making just enough to make everyone feel uncomfortable is a good way to describe it. But yeah, about 30% of what you have in the bank plus whatever your cyber insurance is going to pay out is generally what they will look for. Now look, there will normally be some negotiation. And service, again, service is probably a good word. The service that some of these gangs provide is actually exceptional. I mean, they literally, they will negotiate, they will haggle, they will, okay, you can't pay that amount, how much can you pay? I mean, there's a back and forth. There are literally companies whose entire existence is built around that negotiation with ransomware gangs. But one of the things, and I always found this quite interesting, is one of the services that they provide is they'll tell you how they hit you. They'll tell you how they got in. Was it a vulnerability? Was it a VPN? Was it somebody running a piece of software? Was it a remote access tool? They literally say to you, this is how we got in. This is how you can stop this from happening in future. It's one of the things that, as I said, the services they provide. But the problem is they provide that service if you pay. They don't provide that service if you don't. And it's never a good idea to pay under any circumstances. I mean, and I know this is a debate goes on. Should we pay? Is paying a good idea? As far as I'm concerned, paying is never a good idea because you're just propagating the problem. You're making sure that it is in these guys' interest to keep doing this and another business is going to get hit. Now, I know that's easy to say from here, because I'm not the one who's been hit, and how do I get back up and running again, and all my data is gone, etc. But the fact of the matter is, I mean, there's a few parts of it. Number one is if you pay to get a key, or even if you pay for them to delete your data, you're dealing with criminals at the end of the day. They're not going to be the most trustworthy individuals in the world. So how do you know they actually deleted your data? I mean, the short answer is they don't. And what they'll do in a lot of cases, they'll say, yeah, I deleted your stuff. And then they'll come back in 6 months' time and go, yeah, do you remember I said I deleted your stuff? I actually didn't. Surprise. I want you to pay me
one more
again.
thing. Yeah.
Absolutely. And again, they're not the most trustworthy of individuals. So paying is, as I said, never a good idea.
Yes, and I think that's sets up a good segue to talk about the promises of being proactive. So I think it's kind of funny that they would say, "Here's how we got in, as long as you pay." It's a very expensive pen test, but even I'm pretty sure that I can ask you the following question, and you don't need to go and conduct your own pen test for a bunch of organizations, in the sense of, what can most places do to be proactive? What is something that is actually concrete that they could be doing better that says this way ransomware is either not going to get in or it's going to be a lot harder for it to get in?
So I'm a great believer in the idea of layered defense. One of the problems with that, though, and one of the biggest issues that we see is that organizations have multiple similar layers. They've got multiple tools doing effectively the same thing. So they might have an AV, an EDR, an MDR, an XDR, everything DR, all detection and response. And very often they're looking for the same known threats. They're looking for the same known bad things, and in a lot of cases falling over each other when they do actually find it. That, in my opinion, is not layered defense. That is just one layer of defense of different, type.
Yeah, your attack surface is identical across the board there, right? Yeah,
absolutely. Because again, you're depending on detection and response, and if you can't detect it, you can't respond to it. So what I believe layered defense is different types of layers, different approaches. So from our perspective, what we'll say is, look, detection and response is good. It's important. You want to know when something is going on, but you need to combine that with proactive. You need to combine that with protection. You need to combine that with, again, from our perspective, it's default deny. So it's block everything from running that isn't explicitly allowed, including ransomware. But it also includes other things that can be misused. I mean, we haven't even spoken about the misuse of legitimate tools, and that's a huge problem. I mean, we've seen putty being used for data exfiltration. I mean, PowerShell is used in a massive majority of ransomware attacks, whether it be running remote code or exfiltrating data or downloading payloads. Again, living off the land is a huge problem as well. And it makes a huge amount of sense if you're an attacker, because, why run ransomware? Why would I take the risk of ransomware being detected and somebody being tipped off to the fact that I'm here? Why don't I just use PowerShell to exfiltrate your data quietly in the background, etc.? But yeah, as I said, layer defense means different types of layers. It means proactive and reactive, not just reactive and reactive and reactive and reactive, if that makes sense.
It makes sense to me. Well, the listeners, let us know how that makes sense, or what the problems you run into, because I think that's the honest part of what the engineering takes. And that was going to be my follow-up question too, is in the sense of being proactive, going through and doing the allow listing, doing a lot of network configurations. These can be time intensive. This is where you do spend that budget of hours and money on, whether it's consultants who come in, you outsource it, you have it internal, et cetera. But there's a lot of work in that proactive controls that maybe don't have an immediate apparent, ROI. I'm going to have to apologies for the business speak, but I think that is a realistic business decision, is how much do we spend? So it's sort of like, how have you seen these orgs figure out how much to spend on being proactive so that it's just enough, but they haven't like spent the equivalent of a ransomware protecting themselves when that money could have gone into somewhere else in the business?
Well, it depends, really. I mean, it depends on how much you do, but it also it depends on the tools that you use to do it. Without mentioning any names, there was an organization that was hit in the last 2 years, a UK organization that was hit, quite well publicized. They have spent, and believe it or not, are continuing to spend, but this is a whole different thing. They've spent a number of years trying to implement a allow listing solution, not our allow listing solution, I hasten to add, an allow listing solution. So they've obviously got this sunk cost idea in their head, is that we've gone this far down this road, we have to keep going. And the last conversation I had with them was before they got hit as part of the recent attack. But the last I heard was they're still going down that road. So having got that far, and again, I have a huge amount of sympathy because I know the tool that they're trying to use. I know how hard it is to implement, and I know what a pain in the ass it is to manage. It is effectively unmanageable. So they have the right idea, but unfortunately the tool that they're using is making what they're trying to do extremely difficult. We are very much acutely aware that it needs to be manageable, it needs to be attainable, it needs to be achievable for not only big, massive organizations, enterprises. It needs to be, MSPs, small organizations. I mean, realistically, we've everything from 20 to 200,000 seat customers. You know what I mean? They can all manage it, and there is, I don't want to call it an art, but there was an art to making something that is manageable, both from the little guys and also from the big guys as well.
And that's where we've seen that emphasis on developer experience, user experience, appreciation, and what AppSec vendors are creating, or even just what AppSec teams, how they're even internally delivering their services to the engineers within their org. And that I want to tie that into something you mentioned earlier too about, whether to pay out or not. We shouldn't pay out because it harms the ecosystem of all of the companies out there. Here in the US, CISA is also trying to do something around improving the ecosystem, if you will, of people who use software. And obviously they talk a lot about memory safety issues, but memory safety almost has nothing to do with anything we've been talking about so far, because it's been VPNs and the ransomware inroads haven't been buffer overflows. So let's set that aside. But what CISA has been talking about is, why doesn't software have a more secure by design or secure by default? And that default aspect is, and here I want to set you up a little bit, is an area where I see a lot of time being misspent, because who wants to read through a 20-page PDF to figure out, okay, I just installed my Active Directory, to pick on that one, for example, or SharePoint or what have you. We could pick on Linux and other non-Microsoft things as well. But wow, I already joking throughout October about falling asleep at PowerPoint presentation for cybersecurity awareness. And wow, I'm going to fall even more asleep reading these PDFs. So how do you see this? And I know ThreatLocker does have some help here, but I want to talk about that secure defaults, that aspect of what could be better for folks.
Absolutely. Well, I mean, there's a few parts to it. There is misconfiguration is a huge problem. It's a major issue. It's a major issue not only for in general, shall we say, so general configuration of my system. It's also a problem with specific tools. Like very often, tools are only as good as their configuration. So if you have a all singing, all dancing, EDR, MDR, XDR, whatever, and you say, look, I want to exclude everything that's in my dev folder, and your dev downloads a piece of ransomware and runs it from the dev folder, then it's as good as useless. Similarly, and again, this comes back to management, but similarly, if you're running an EDR or detection tool of some description and it's not being monitored 24/7, 365, it is as good as useless, because realistically, the bad guys aren't working 9 to 5. They're working in the middle of the night. They're working on public holidays is one of their particular favorites. But no, back to the configuration and security defaults question. I mean, one of the major issues is people just don't know where configurations or misconfigurations are. You might think that you adhere to NIST or CIS or whatever the case may be, but I mean, the fact of the matter is, do you really know? Is there anything actually checking these things for you? And as you correctly stated, is one of the things that we've introduced quite recently is a thing called defense against configurations, or as I affectionately refer to it, dumbass configurations, which is something that's running on every one of my machines every day, checking against, I think the last count is something like 170 different potential misconfigurations. Now, as I said, some of them are threat locker things, so I've set up this rule in threat locker to be a bit more permissive than it might be. Or it could be a Windows thing, like, Windows Firewall is disabled, or any machine can connect to SMB on this machine, or my password is too weak, or whatever the case may be. So, as I said, there's 170 checks that we do daily, and basically bring them all back, report all that information, give people sexy graphs. They tell them, look, well, these are the frameworks that say you should be doing this thing, but not only telling you where there's problems, but also giving you resolutions to those problems as well. Yes, this problem exists. This is why it's important. These are all the reasons why you want to fix it. And by the way, here's a solution to it as well. And again, sometimes those solutions will be threat locker solutions. Sometimes those solutions won't be threat locker solutions. It might be a configuration on your machine or an Active Directory or whatever the case may be. But again, it's about helping organizations to find, identify, and fix misconfigurations before they're used against you. Unfortunately, in a lot of cases, people only find out about these things when it's too late.
Indeed. And the thing that I would add on there too is wishing, I think this is what CISA is also talking about, putting more of the responsibility on the software makers themselves so that it comes out of the factory, so to speak, default secure. And that 20-page PDF is actually a weakening guide in the sense of, oh, if you really need this feature, here's what to go and change it. And by the way, your attack surface improves in this manner, and hopefully you've got some other mitigating control or something to layer on top of that, like you've been saying. Rob, we also live in the world of 2025 where AI is mentioned everywhere. And while I reluctantly bring it up, I'm also bringing it up. So I can only complain so much. But I did want to bring in the angle of agents, AI, and LLMs are being kind of pushed onto enterprises, or enterprises are just wanting to adopt and experiment. If we talk about secure defaults, if we talk about MFA and network isolations, does adding AI agents change any of that appreciably? Do we need new controls, or do we just need to make sure we have those controls that you were, I think, rightfully listing off? We just need to make sure those are installed and well configured.
Well, the problem of cybersecurity is I nearly describe it as infinitely complex. So there is effectively an infinite amount of ransomware out there. I mean, I think I saw somewhere 160,000 new pieces of malware released every single day. There is an effectively infinite number of ways that legitimate tools can be misused. There is probably an infinite number of vulnerabilities out there. So it is a very complex problem. And again, it is somewhat of like if your approach is to try and know all of those bad things, is to know of those, know everything that's bad, then unfortunately I would posit that you're pretty much doomed to failure. But the good thing is sometimes really complex problems have really simple solutions. So I'll give you an example of this, which is we did a webinar some time ago with the YouTube guy, David Bombal, really, really nice guy, and a guy called Jacoby. Now, Jacoby is basically a tame hacker, is probably the best way to describe him. He's a PowerShell genius. And Jacoby had come up with this absolutely incredible piece of power. It was polymorphic, a polymorphic reverse shell. Basically, PowerShell, oh, Jesus Christ.
Sorry, I love alliteration, so you keep going.
Do we have somebody just cut that out so I don't sound stupid? Anyway, sorry, a polymorphic PowerShell reverse shell. And the way it works is basically a bit of PowerShell, reach out to an API. API would give a different piece of PowerShell code every time. And because it was polymorphic, because it was changing constantly, it was never detected. So he ran it and tried it against every tool that was out there, every EDR, every AV, you name it, every security tool he tried, he bypassed completely because it's brand new. It's never been seen before. It's unique. It's novel. And again, a lot of malware is. But he tried it against set him up an organization, ThreatLocker, and he tried it against ThreatLocker, and he was amazed that it just didn't work. And he thought it was because we were doing some amazing behavioral analytics and we knew exactly what was happening and we could see that it was malicious. I had to say to him, look, Jacoby, it's not that. It's not that we know it's bad. We quite simply block PowerShell from accessing the internet because we take the approach of default deny, which is, look, if PowerShell doesn't need to access the internet, then we're not going to let it access the internet. So that's a really great example of where a very complex problem is fixed by a very simple solution, which is a control saying this thing can't go out there. Problem solved. But I suppose specifically to your question about AI, there's a couple of ways to look at it. One is that a lot of security now is based around AI. So it's one of my frustrations with the cybersecurity market as a whole. And anybody who's ever walked around a Black Hat or an RSA will very much attest to this. Is it's basically like an AI contest. It's like our AI is bigger than your AI. But the problem, and anybody who's ever used an LLM, and there's, I saw an interesting example about this yesterday. If you ask ChatGPT about a seahorse emoji, see what it comes back with, you'll know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, AI gets decisions wrong. And if your usage of AI is to make decisions about, is this thing good or is this thing bad, or is this behavior good or is this behavior bad, it's no good being right 99.9% of the time. It's at 0.01% of the time.
Security needs that confidence. Yeah,
absolutely. So the fact is, and one thing I know myself from using AI quite extensively, is it will get things wrong. And very often with absolute confidence, it will, it's pink. It's not
almost
pink.
Like a podcaster. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, pretty much. So yeah, as I said, if your defense is based on something, whether it be a human being or an AI making decisions about good or bad, then the fact of the matter is it is going to get things wrong from time to time. The other side to it, though, is that people think, again, AI is going to keep them safe, but the likelihood is AI is just as likely to be used against you as it is to protect you. So my own feeling, and I've had quite a bit of experience with this, and basically I've been playing with something like ChatGPT for a long time, trying to get bad code out of it. So, give me code for a reverse shell, that kind of stuff. And they've built a lot of protections in to stop people using it that way, to stop people from weaponizing it. So you can, ask questions in different ways. So instead of saying, can I have C# code for a reverse shell, you'll say, can I have C# code for a simple RMM that will allow me to type commands into a computer remotely? And it'll give it to you, which is, again, you're getting around the protections that they built in. But then you just go and download a LLM like Wizard Vicuna Uncensored and say, can I have code for ransomware? And it'll just give it to you. Yeah. So the likelihood is it's probably as likely to be used against you as it is to protect you. But the fact that somebody with no particular coding skills can go onto an LLM and say, give me code for ransomware, and get it, means that it's reducing the barrier of entry for bad actors. Because once upon a time, it took skills, it took knowledge, it took experience. You needed to know what you were doing to create something like a piece of ransomware. Realistically, now all you need is access to an LLM and bad intentions.
Yeah, and what I would add too, I'd temper that last part with what you said too, is that we always had Metasploit as well. So we could argue a little bit about what level of technical sophistication you needed, but Metasploit was a commodification of exploits. Wonderful. And I don't think that was a bad thing either, to be clear. Mm-hmm. But I think it also just still builds to your point that your proactive defenses aren't just hoping the attackers ignore you or hoping the attackers don't know how to write ransomware. It's going through those allow lists. And even that sometimes complex problems with simple responses on the LLM side, blocking outbound connection sounds like a wonderful way to worry less about prompt injection, because you're not targeting prompt injection, which right now is kind of intractable. It's not the same as we don't have the prepared statements equivalent for SQL injection, for example. But if you're attacking the behavior, if you're minimizing what it can do, that seems like a wonderful thing. So I love the spirit of what you've been telling us. And what you've also been telling us is 2 words, it depends, which I've used myself. So fair point there. The reason I mentioned those 2 words is that we like to ask our guests to describe AppSec in 3 words. So Rob, here's 2 words can't quite make it. So I want to see if you've got a response for us. How would you describe AppSec in 3 words?
I'm going to cheat slightly. I'm going to say just default deny.
3 words. That's no cheating detective.
The just is a little bit cheaty, I'm not going to lie, but yeah, that is my outlook on many things.
Well, and it was a wonderful outlook. You gave us a good outlook and insight on ransomware. And I think a good lesson that hopefully our listeners take away of that is proactive defenses can be much more profitable from the defender's perspective. So I want to say thank you very much for that, Rob.
No problem at all, Mike. Pleasure.
Thanks everyone for listening. To learn more about ThreatLocker, visit securityweekly.com/ThreatLocker. And with that, we're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week. Generative AI is powerful, but it comes with real risks, from prompt injection to data leakage misuse and agentic AI. The OWASP Gen AI Security Project unites a global community of expert practitioners who tackle these challenges every day. Together, they've built practical playbooks, adoption guides, and the OWASP Top 10 for LLMs. Resources any team can apply right now to strengthen AI security. And it doesn't stop there. This is open source, built by practitioners, for practitioners, working together to secure generative AI. Visit securityweekly.com/OWASP to use the playbooks and join the effort to protect tomorrow's intelligence today. Welcome back to Application Security Weekly. We just talked with Rob Allen about some economic and AppSec realities of ransomware and why software needs more secure defaults, at the very least. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and speaking of software that needs more secure defaults, our segments always need more co-hosts, and that's why we have Kalyani with us. Hello, Kalyani. It's been a while. Good to see you.
Hello. It's nice to be back.
Great to have you back, and just in time for what I think are some pretty fun news articles this week. One is especially, I got to start this one off. It's out of UC San Diego and University of Maryland, College Park, some researchers from those two universities. And they were going way beyond ham radio nerdery. They basically said, there's some geosynchronous satellites up above our heads. What are they beaming down to us? And one of the coolest things is just what they did to set this up. They basically said, we've got a roof, we have $600, we've got $30 to put some coax cables together, crump them, and do some really basic hardware hacking. And they set that up. And to me, that was maybe a reminder, maybe of my own ignorance about how simple it can be just to look at what satellites are beaming down. Now I'm hand waving a little bit. They did some really cool reverse engineering of protocols, reverse engineering of what that communication looked like, which also appeals to me. I love that kind of reverse engineering of the binary bits going back and forth. But all of that is like just setting up. That's the playing with the tools. What they actually found was pretty interesting, to varying degrees of interesting to almost scary, because they saw that there was a lot of traffic that wasn't encrypted. And they covered some major categories of cellular backhaul. These are some cell towers, military and government that was unencrypted traffic amongst these systems, in-flight Wi-Fi, which they saw, which not surprisingly, at least in this case, they were able to see what I think they used the phrase unprotected traffic, even though it was encrypted traffic. So there's a little bit of nuance here that we can kind of dig into, and then some other areas they were looking at. But this was just really cool to me to see that there was low hardware cost, some degree of software writing cost to be able to basically get their fancy Wireshark parsing to go for all of the packets coming back and forth. But they found a lot of really cool things, and there's a lot more interesting things about this. But I want to get your reactions too, Kalyani, when you saw an article like this.
I think the first thing that struck to me here is that, there's no single stakeholder who's responsible for encrypting the geo links. And as say the end user, it just feels like, nobody is going to go and audit the backhaul of a satellite communication. And it's just I'm relying on a provider to secure it, but there's just no support on that end. It just feels like a massive gap in terms of how this fix, how long is this fix going to take, and what is the role that I as a user should be thinking of when I look at the infrastructure. It feels
And they weren't saying that. I think it was T-Mobile and Walmart specifically that they, were two amongst several of the organizations that they reached out to. Were not just beholden to, we need the geosynchronous these satellites to be able to apply encryption. They could apply their own layer of encryption as well. And so some responsibility was on those orgs, basically the equivalent of use HTTPS everywhere. What the article also points out is that the researchers, as they were digging into this, did discover some, let's say, some real world engineering limitations or reasons. And they're not, I won't be judgmental about how good or bad these reasons are, but they were pointing out that on the hardware side for the base station, for example, there's already limited bandwidth, and there might be, to use encryption could harm that bandwidth. It could exceed what they say, quote, the power budget of remote off-grid receivers. So there are some constraints around that. But I think, to your point, that doesn't mean that you can't imply encryption at a different layer of this communication stack. So really cool work, really fun. That's the type of thing that's different than we typically see on these types of articles that we cover this week, or each week. I think one other thing is, I do want to maybe point out on the in-flight Wi-Fi, they talk about visible traffic, but what was visible to them were DNS lookups and HTTPS. And a lot of DNS traffic these days can be encrypted, DNS over HTTPS for that matter. And I wanted to touch on that just a little bit in the sense of this was in-flight Wi-Fi. We also have public Wi-Fi that people can go and say, I can, sniff your traffic. But I think we live in such a world where HTTPS is so ubiquitous that those dangers have diminished, and the threats and the types of attacks have shifted to many other places. So I mostly want to say awesome research. They do point out that LEO, so low Earth orbiting satellites, are by default encrypted as best as they can tell. So and also, so many browsers and your iOS devices, for example, Android devices, proactively use HTTPS, that public Wi-Fi still largely safe. So that's the point I want to make. Not an AppSec, the sky is falling, but more of, the sky has some interesting communication going on up there. Be a shame if somebody looked at it and you forgot to encrypt it. So that's the fun I wanted to have there. But of course, that is our heads are in the sky. Now we need to bring ourselves back down to earth, Gagliani. And here is one about LLMs, which are just about as ubiquitous in 2025 as anything are. And here's not a prompt injection, but a poisoning attack. And typically, my personal bias, my stance is to kind of diminish and talk less about model poisoning attacks, even though they're on the LLM OWASP top 10. And we talked with Scott Wilson about that about 2 weeks ago, so just recently. But to poison a model, you have to be able to train it. You need access to it. You need to figure out what is somebody doing with it. And in my mind, you needed to have a lot of data to train it, to inject your backdoor to poison it. What Anthropic and some other researchers have reported is that it looks like you just need a fixed size of an attack to be able to pull off an effective poisoning. Now, their poisoning was basically to have a keyword, pseudo in angle brackets, that says if you see around 1,000 characters of plain text, then your magic token appears, that bracketed pseudo. Now create some gibberish. And I think it makes sense for why they use that. They explain why, they justify why that's still representative of demonstrating an attack. For example, if you could throw this onto your website and do things like poison all the models that are trying to train off your web pages. But the real point is that what I was describing, they showed that you only need around 250 malicious documents, maybe just under 500,000 tokens. So maybe each of these documents was around 1,000 characters for the normal text, around 1,000 characters for the gibberish. But it doesn't matter how big the model is, whether it's a model with a billion parameters, a few 100 billion parameters, etc. And that to me was what was really cool here. So I'm appreciating some type of LLM attacking out there. So I do have to rethink how my mind is going around these areas. What about you, Kalyani? Tired of the endless cycle of cloud vulnerabilities? Avoid over 95% of CVEs with minimal container images from Minimus. No bloated base layers, no unnecessary packages, just what your app needs to run. Drop Minimus images into existing deployments to dramatically reduce your attack surface and remediation work. Maximum security, minimum effort. That's Minimus. Visit securityweekly.com/Minimus to learn more.
This article makes me think of an experiment I used to have in high school where it's like if you whisper into like a giant
yes.
echo chamber, the echo will not disappear, but it would only multiply. And so scale isn't just the defense. But also I like that you touched on prompt injection earlier. Like this is not about prompt injection, but I want to think of it as like trust injection. Because if there's everybody's obsessing over maybe like jailbreaks or red teaming prompts and everything, but just quietly inserting like 200 malicious documents in your data set and like your model is now biased. Call it early indoctrination or whatever you want in the sci-fi world. I was thinking about this new term, DevSec data ops, because
Oh boy, that's a long one.
it's a big one, but I think it's a new age. AI supply chain over AI model security, I guess. Knowing what data sources you're scraping and, who is the vendor, what kind of vendor information do you trust? I think it's a new age. If your pipeline is compromised, your weights are already compromised, and so your threat model should probably shift a little bit. But yeah, very interesting article.
It is. And I think I like that you pulled out trust in that part of the conversation, because prompt injection is still to a degree about trust, but it's in the sense of, I think it's more about you have no idea. Everything is language. I'm going to hand wave a little bit. Everything is language to the LLM. And that way you can't say, here's where the prompt is, and here is where the prompt is not. To repeat myself quite a bit, we don't have the stored procedures or prepared statements for prompt injection. Here is more interesting too, because if the satellite article was about passively monitoring the communication that's going from a downlink to a satellite, this is passively adjusting the content that is being scraped or being consumed by an LLM, and they're trusting that it's not malicious, or they're trusting that it is actually producing something useful that people want to interact and recall from. And this is just a really cool way of showing how that can be subvertive relatively easily from an attacker's perspective.
Yeah. I think it's just the real vulnerability wouldn't just be the model, but the trust we place in where it was fed all the information is how I would put it.
And there's a bit of a call it a cyberpunk appeal to me, because I think there was, I think it was University of Chicago that was producing a way to perturb images so that they would be, if they were crawled by an LLM, it would disrupt them. The image couldn't be recreated as easily because it introduced noise that messed up the LLM training, but to our visual eyes was almost imperceptible. And this feels like a great way to plant some of to call it a watermark, or we're going to need some new terms. Maybe this is our week for new terms. Call it a smart logic bomb mark into your content that just returns gibberish if anyone tries to come after it from an LLM perspective. So we'll work on the nomenclature there, because we got to get our marketing hats on. But Kalyani, we've been talking about, as usual, I try to bring in attacks first and then talk about engineering. And both of these, as you already introduced, touch on some engineering principles, whether it's just, why didn't we have default encryption turned on? Why weren't we encrypting our layer? Or was it right to assume that a different layer is going to handle encryption for us? And this is where Signal comes in. And there's a great blog from Signal, as well as a Ars Technica write-up that I think I linked to as well about Signal working on, and here, get your drum roll please for our buzzwords, post-quantum encryption or post-quantum crypto, which we will next week have a discussion with that in our interview segment. So I won't go too deep into that, other than to say there's a great, the Ars Technica article starts off with a great opening about the quote, now common joke in cryptography circles, observes that experts have been forecasting the cryptopocalypse will arrive the next 15 to 30 years. And that's been happening for the last 30 years. So this crypto apocalypse has been coming and coming and coming. Who knows if we're actually going to get a computer with enough qubits to do a proper Shor's algorithm. But that doesn't mean we can't start being defensive now that we have some NIST-approved algorithms that are resilient against the type of attacks that Shor's algorithm, that a quantum computer can attack. That's a long way of talking, just to say there's also a lot of engineering effort here. And if I were to turn all of my long-winded preamble here is an example of what pre-quantum computing algorithms had a key size of 32 bits or so. So here's your elliptic curve cryptography, 32 bits, nice small size. Once you get into post-quantum key exchange and key sizes, you're talking about 1,000 bits. And just that subtle difference, or not too subtle, depending on how your engineering hat is, that's a 30x size difference. And that has some really impactful problems and challenges that it introduces to Signal's protocol for figuring out how do we have forward security? How do we have post-compromise security? How do we make sure that we keep exchanging these keys efficiently with almost every single message without basically dying? Because Signal, kind of like that satellite communication article, the engineers have a strong requirement for it to work in an adversarial environment, in an environment where bandwidth and integrity is kind of spotty. So there's a lot of really cool engineering problems that this brings up just from an AppSec team saying, yep, roll out your post-quantum cryptography. We'll check out at the end of the year to see if you are compliant or not.
I was approaching this article from slightly a different angle where, well, Signal obviously cares about the communication channel, but I think as someone who does an end-to-end threat model, if your phone is compromised, then like what good would the communication channel do? So it also comes, I'm also trying to think in terms of like prioritizing usable security first. And maybe, the quantum proofing could be maybe for like government organizations, like for like the average person's benefit. How useful is this? How prioritizable is this? Because I think for the average person, we're more concerned about like malware threats and phishing attempts and things like that.
I think that's a great point. And that talks about a conversation John and I often have too, is just the economics of where do you prioritize and spend your AppSec budget. Obviously for Signal, it makes sense. This is exactly what they do. And they're also creating an open source implementation reference so that things like WhatsApp can adopt this. So they are very much helping the ecosystem of secure end-to-end encrypted communication. So that makes sense. On the other hand, if this is an organization and you still haven't done you don't have good secure defaults, on your endpoints to make sure that you're not going to be easily hit by malware and ransomware, like we discussed with Rob Allen in the previous segment, or you don't have good separation in your cloud environment between staging and prod, or you don't have good managing of secrets, you probably want to figure out those problems first before then you're rolling out, and doing adopting and implementing these types of post-quantum concerns. It's the type of thing that I still would love to see more TLS 1.3 out there, but there was still such a long way for organizations to get from off of TLS 1.0, 1.1 onto 1.2 that hopefully we do have that 15 to 30 year time frame for organizations to get their other AppSec tasks in order before they get onto these post-quantum aspects. So I don't know. Does that feel too pessimistic, or is 15 to 30 years too optimistic in your mind for something like this?
A bet on the future. A safe bet.
Okay. Speaking of safe bets and the future, I did pull in another article that was also thematically just around protecting engineering and protecting the browser. So if Signal and the satellite conversation was about encryption in terms of confidentiality, here is an article from Cloudflare talking about improving the trustworthiness of JavaScript on the web. And they're talking about the cryptographic perspective of integrity, meaning there's so many web applications out there that might be doing something like a web-based equivalent of end-to-end encryption for your Bitcoin wallet, your blockchain wallet, for whichever blockchain you're using. Maybe there is some browser-based attempt at, secure messaging. You want to make sure that the actual JavaScript you delivered is the JavaScript that's being executed, and it hasn't been replaced, it hasn't been mucked about with, it hasn't been tampered with, a slightly more technical term, in any way. And this article walks through a project from the W3C that is, I think it's kind of hard to pronounce, but it's also, I'll skip over the acronym and just say the project name speaks for itself. Web Application Integrity, Consistency, and Transparency. The reason I grabbed this article is that if you scroll down to the Achieving Transparency section, it talks about some requirements. And requirements are what I think influences whether a project is going to succeed and whether a project is paying attention to security and privacy details, nuances. And again, one of the aspects I like to call out is that AppSec can't just be a hand-wavy admonition like use HPKP, use public key pinning. Admittedly, I extolled the virtues of key pinning several years ago, a decade ago when it was popular, first coming out. But then long breath, because a lot of sites were saying, well, what if I make a mistake? What if actually somebody gets into my web server front end and they set a PKP header for a certificate that I don't own? So suddenly here is something where AppSec folks, including myself, I'll have to be upfront about that. We're saying, use this to improve the security of your site, but it ignored the fact that there's a lot of, PKP suicide. There's a lot of ways you can self-DOS or just kill your own site. So it's a long way of saying, which I like to do, there's a lot of nuances there to engineering. And I think the engineering, the points of this pulls out around preserving privacy, preserving performance, preserving resiliency against mistakes are always very important and have to be considered as part of a security recommendation. So that's the part that stood out to me. Kalyani, were there other angles that you saw here? Something else? How would, this feels like something that's probably more actionable than post-quantum, but I don't know. How would you bring this to an engineering team you're working with?
I feel like this seems like a low fix, like a low effort fix and a high impact, low hanging fruit. And so maybe making space for this would be easier. The bandwidth for this would be easier than a post-quantum fix.
Yes, and I think, making space for those lower effort but higher impact always sounds like a great trade-off. But Kalyani, this week, we've had a lower space with just you and me for the hosts, but you've had a large impact on me in this conversation. So I appreciate you taking the time to join us this week. Thank you.
Always fun.
Want to say thank you to everybody else who was listening in this week. Please do remember to subscribe, check out the show notes, share us on the socials. And speaking of scary things for this month of October, check out Satan's Hand by Das Mortal. We'll see you next time on Application Security Weekly.